What kind of world produces a revolutionary who never truly belongs to any single place? There are figures whose lives seem to begin already in motion, shaped less by a single moment than by a slow accumulation of pressures. Sun Yat-sen is often remembered as a symbol, father of the nation, revolutionary, unifier. But symbols tend to flatten what was once uncertain. Before the slogans and the posthumous reverence, there was a child born into a southern Chinese village at a time when the ground beneath the Qing Empire was already beginning to give way. The story does not begin with politics. It begins with distance. Sun Yat-sen was born in 1866 in Kuomintang, a small village in Zhongshan County, Guangdong. By imperial standards, it was peripheral, far from Beijing, far from the court, far from power. Yet Guangdong was not isolated. It was porous. Trade, migration, rumor, and foreign influence passed through its ports and coastlines with unusual ease. Historians suggest that this mattered. Southern China, especially Guangdong, had long been exposed to outside ideas and disruptions. The Opium Wars had left scars, not only on China's sovereignty, but on its confidence. Missionaries moved inland. Foreign merchants set up enclaves. Local people watched Qing authority retreat, negotiate, or fail. Kuomintang itself was modest, agricultural, structured by kinship and tradition. Sun's family were peasants, not elites. His father worked intermittently as a tailor and laborer, including time abroad in Hawaii. That detail, often mentioned briefly, would later prove consequential. From the beginning, Sun's world was split between rootedness and absence. Family members left. Money came from elsewhere. The village remained, but it was never sealed. There is little reliable record of Sun Yat-sen's earliest thoughts. What survives are later recollections, often shaped by political purpose. Still, certain conditions are difficult to ignore. The Qing Dynasty in the late 19th century was visibly strained. Natural disasters, population pressure, corruption, and foreign encroachment weakened the legitimacy of imperial rule. For villages like those in Kuomintang, governance was distant and often ineffective. Authority was present mostly through taxes, rituals, and the occasional official intervention. It is believed that Sun grew up witnessing a contradiction. The empire claimed cosmic order, yet everyday life suggested vulnerability and decay. This tension between proclaimed stability and lived uncertainty would recur throughout his life. Unlike many revolutionaries, Sun did not come from a background of classical scholarship. He was not trained from childhood for the civil service examinations. This absence mattered as much as any presence. He was not invested in the system that defined elite success. Instead, his education would come from elsewhere. As a teenager, Sun was sent to Hawaii to join his elder brother, Sun Mei. Hawaii was not China, but it was full of Chinese. Migrant communities carried language, customs, and grievances across the Pacific. They also carried comparisons. In Honolulu, Sun attended missionary schools. He learned English. He encountered Christianity. He saw a society organized differently, less hierarchical, more visibly technological, more assertive about progress. None of this converted him instantly into a reformer, but it introduced contrast. The experience of Hawaii is often described as formative, but not in simple ways. Sun did not become Western in identity. Rather, he became aware of difference. He saw that China's weakness was not inevitable, and that other systems, however flawed, operated with greater coherence and power. Historians debate how deeply Sun internalized Christian belief versus Christian structure. What seems clearer is that he absorbed a sense of moral critique. Christianity offered a language of renewal, corruption, and salvation, ideas that could later be secularized. More importantly, Hawaii showed him that China was being observed, judged, and surpassed. Sun eventually returned to China, but he did not return unchanged. He was now a young man who spoke English, had lived abroad, and had been exposed to foreign education. This placed him in an ambiguous position. He was neither fully traditional nor fully foreign. This ambiguity followed him. In later years, critics would question his authenticity. Supporters would praise his global outlook. But at this early stage, it meant something simpler. He did not fit easily into existing categories. He briefly pursued medical studies in Hong Kong, another liminal space. A British colony, governed by foreign law, yet populated largely by Chinese. Hong Kong was modern, disciplined, unequal. It offered opportunity, but also reminded Chinese students daily of imperial subordination. Sun trained as a physician. The choice itself is telling. Medicine was practical, empirical, and reform-oriented. It aimed to diagnose and cure rather than preserve tradition. Some historians have noted how often Sun later used medical metaphors to describe China as sick, poisoned, in need of radical treatment. Yet even as he studied medicine, something else was forming. He was not content to heal individuals. The illness, as he saw it, was systemic. At this stage, Sun Yat-sen was not yet a revolutionary in the modern sense. He did not lead movements or command followers. What he had was dissatisfaction and a growing sense that the Qing state was incapable of reforming itself. It is important not to project later certainty backward. The record remains unclear about exactly when Sun decided that revolution, rather than reform, was necessary. Early on, he explored petitions and proposals. He believed, briefly, that officials might listen. They did not. A famous early attempt involved submitting a reform proposal to a Qing official. It was ignored. The rejection was not dramatic, but it was instructive. The system was closed. Ideas from the margins did not travel upward. This moment is often cited as a turning point, but perhaps it is better understood as confirmation rather than revelation. The sense of futility had been accumulating for years. Sun's environment also mattered. Guangdong had a long history of rebellion and secret societies. Anti-Qing sentiment was not rare. Local militias, underground networks, and diaspora funding created a culture where resistance was imaginable. Sun did not invent dissent. He entered the space where dissent already existed, but lacked coordination or vision. Many rebels were motivated by local grievances or nostalgia for earlier dynasties. Sun's difference would later lie in his attempt to articulate a national framework. At this stage, however, he was still listening. The Qing state appeared increasingly incapable of defending China's sovereignty. Foreign powers carved out concessions. Japan's rise after the Meiji Restoration offered an especially sharp contrast. An Asian nation had modernized, militarized, and defeated China in war. For someone like Sun, this was not abstract geopolitics. It was evidence. By the early 1890s, Sun Yat-sen had accumulated experiences that did not yet cohere into doctrine, but were difficult to ignore. A peasant childhood in a declining empire, exposure to overseas Chinese communities, Western education and Christianity, medical training emphasizing diagnosis and intervention, repeated encounters with imperial indifference. None of these alone produce a revolutionary. Together, they created a mindset that was restless, comparative, and impatient. Sun was not driven by rage in these years. The tone of his later writings suggests disappointment more than hatred. He believed China could be saved, but not by the people currently in charge. What remained unresolved was how. There is something quiet about this phase of Sun Yat-sen's life. No uprisings, no speeches that shook the nation. Just a man moving between villages, colonies, classrooms and clinics, observing failure from multiple angles. It is tempting to read destiny into these origins, but that risks oversimplification. Many young men experienced similar conditions and chose different paths. Sun could have remained a doctor. He could have settled abroad. He could have lived quietly. That he did not raises questions that this part cannot answer. Why did dissatisfaction turn into resolve? Why did observation become intervention? Why did Sun, rather than others, step forward? At the edge of this first chapter, the future is not yet visible. What exists instead is a growing sense that the old order is hollow and that treating symptoms will no longer be enough. The diagnosis has begun. The prescription has not.
At what point does dissatisfaction stop being private and begin to demand witnesses? There is a moment, often difficult to locate, when a person's internal unease turns outward. Not yet action, not yet leadership, but an orientation toward confrontation. For Sun Yat-sen, this moment did not arrive as a sudden break. It accumulated quietly through rejection, movement, and a growing realization that the structures he observed were not merely flawed, but resistant to repair. By the early 1890s, Sun Yat-sen was a trained physician. He had studied medicine in Hong Kong, passed his examinations, and was licensed to practice. On paper, this was success. In practice, it was an uneasy fit. Medical training had given Sun a vocabulary of causality. Symptoms pointed to underlying disease. Temporary relief without structural change was inadequate. This way of thinking would later migrate into his political language, but at the time it created tension. Medicine addressed individuals. Sun's concerns were increasingly collective. Hong Kong itself reinforced this discomfort. It was efficient, orderly, and visibly modern. It was also foreign-ruled. British law prevailed. Chinese residents were governed but not sovereign. For a Chinese intellectual, this was both a lesson and an insult. Historians suggest that Hong Kong did not radicalize Sun through humiliation alone. Rather, it provided a living comparison. Here was a system that functioned, yet excluded Chinese authority. The implication was unsettling. Competence and power were not aligned with cultural continuity. Sun's education sharpened his questions, but it did not offer belonging. He remained between worlds, qualified, articulate, and marginal. Sun began connecting with secret societies, overseas Chinese communities, and anti-Qing activists. These groups varied widely in ideology and cohesion. Some were motivated by local grievances, others by ethnic nationalism, others by vague notions of restoration. Sun did not fully align with any of them at first. He was listening, testing language, searching for a framework that could unify scattered resentments into something larger. It is important to note that Sun was not yet influential. He was often dependent on donors, patrons, and introductions. He lacked institutional backing. His authority came from persistence rather than position. This dependence shaped his politics. He learned early that ideas required funding, that loyalty was fragile, and that exile was a recurring condition rather than an exception. One of the most significant environments in Sun's formation was the overseas Chinese world. In Hawaii, Southeast Asia, and later Japan, Chinese expatriate communities were both vulnerable and energized. They lived outside Qing jurisdiction, but remained emotionally tied to China's fate. Distance allowed clarity. Failure at home was easier to name from abroad. Sun recognized this. He spoke to merchants, laborers, and students. He framed China's weakness as a collective problem requiring collective action. He emphasized dignity, survival, and renewal
rather than abstract ideology. Historians suggest that Sun's early political language was deliberately broad. He avoided rigid doctrine. Instead, he presented revolution as a practical necessity rather than a moral crusade. This approach attracted support, but it also created ambiguity. What exactly would replace the Qing? How would power be exercised? These questions were deferred rather than resolved. Distance made mobilization possible. It also delayed reckoning. In 1894, Sun helped establish the revived China Society, Xinhai. It was small, loosely organized, and often overstated in later accounts. At the time, it represented aspiration more than capability. Still, it marked a shift. This was no longer individual critique. It was collective intent. The society's goals were clear in outline: overthrow the Qing, restore Chinese sovereignty, modernize the nation. The means were less clear. Funding was inconsistent, membership fluctuated, planning exceeded capacity. Sun's role was central but precarious. He was a coordinator, a speaker, a fundraiser. He traveled constantly. He relied on trust, built through personal contact, rather than institutional authority. These years introduced Sun to a recurring pattern: enthusiasm followed by fragmentation. Supporters disagreed, plans collapsed, uprisings failed before they began. Failure, however, did not end his involvement. It hardened it. Sun's activities eventually attracted Qing attention. In 1895, a planned uprising in Guangdong failed. The details are fragmented, but the consequences were clear. Sun was forced into exile. This was his first sustained encounter with the state as an adversary, rather than an abstraction. The Qing government labeled him a criminal. Return meant arrest, possibly execution. Exile changed the stakes. Sun was no longer merely dissatisfied. He was committed. Retreat was not a neutral option. Yet exile also reinforced his marginality. He was now a revolutionary without territory. His movement existed across borders, dependent on shifting alliances and uncertain resources. Historians differ on how close Sun came to despair during this period. His writings suggest determination, but also strain. The gap between ambition and capacity remained wide. Japan became a crucial environment for Sun's formation. Unlike Western powers, Japan represented an Asian path to modernization. Its rapid transformation after the Meiji Restoration challenged assumptions about inevitability and hierarchy. Sun observed Japan closely. He admired its discipline, nationalism, and willingness to break with tradition. He also noted its imperial ambitions. Japan offered both inspiration and warning. Sun interacted with Japanese intellectuals and politicians. These relationships were pragmatic rather than ideological. Japan saw value in weakening the Qing. Sun saw value in learning from Japan's experience. This mutual convenience would later complicate perceptions of Sun's loyalties. At this stage, however, it reinforced his belief that China's stagnation was not cultural destiny, but political failure. By the turn of the century, Sun Yat-sen had crossed a threshold. Reform was no longer his language. Revolution was. This shift did not occur because revolution seemed easy. It occurred because alternatives had collapsed. The Qing state continued to resist meaningful change. Foreign powers expanded influence. Internal rebellions flared and faded. Incrementalism appeared inadequate. Sun's vision remained incomplete. He spoke of nationalism, people's rights, and livelihood, but these concepts were still evolving. What unified his thought was diagnosis rather than prescription. China, in his view, was structurally ill. Partial measures would prolong suffering without restoring strength. Yet, even as his rhetoric hardened, uncertainty remained. Could revolution unify a fragmented society? Could overthrow avoid chaos? Could a man without an army reshape an empire? These questions lingered, unresolved. By the end of this phase, Sun Yat-sen was rarely still. He moved between countries, communities, and identities. Doctor, exile, organizer, petitioner turned conspirator. He had gained clarity of opposition, but not yet clarity of outcome. His relevance was growing, but his power remained limited. He was known, but not decisive. Formation, in this sense, was incomplete. The tools were assembled, but not yet tested at scale. The Qing Dynasty still stood. Sun had not yet struck a blow that could not be ignored. What had changed was his position relative to history. He was no longer observing decline from the margins. He was attempting to intervene in it. Whether that intervention would reshape China, or simply fracture it further, remained an open question. And with each failed plan, each postponed uprising, the distance between intention and consequence narrowed. The next phase would force that distance to collapse. What happens when a long-imagined collapse finally arrives, and the person who prepared for it is not the one who controls it? Power rarely enters history cleanly. It tends to arrive misaligned with expectation, shaped by compromise, coincidence, and urgency. For Sun Yat-sen, the moment of ascension did not resemble triumph. It resembled dislocation. He had spent years preparing for revolution. When it finally came, it did not come from him. In October 1911, an uprising erupted in Wuchang. It was not meticulously planned by Sun Yat-sen. In fact, he was in the United States at the time, raising funds among overseas Chinese communities. The revolt was premature, triggered in part by an accidental explosion that exposed revolutionary cells. Qing authorities moved to arrest suspects. The rebels acted first. What followed was not a coordinated seizure of power, but a cascade. Provinces declared independence. Qing control unraveled faster than anyone, supporter or opponent, had predicted. Historians often note the irony. Sun Yat-sen, the most visible revolutionary figure abroad, was absent at the decisive moment. The revolution he had advocated arrived without his direction. This absence mattered. It shaped the kind of power he would later hold: symbolic, negotiated, and constrained. When Sun returned to China, the political terrain had shifted dramatically. The Qing dynasty was collapsing. Provisional governments were forming. Authority was fragmented among military leaders, provincial assemblies, and revolutionary committees. Sun was welcomed as a figure of legitimacy rather than command. His years of advocacy, exile, and fundraising had given him moral capital. He represented continuity of intent, if not control of force. In January 1912, Sun was named provisional president of the newly declared Republic of China. The title suggested authority. The reality was more fragile. He controlled no unified army. He presided over a coalition of interests that shared opposition to the Qing, but not agreement on the future. The Republic existed largely on paper. Power, in this moment, was conditional. The most significant constraint on Sun's authority was Yuan Shikai. Yuan was a powerful Qing general with control over the Beiyang army, the most modern and disciplined military force in China. Without Yuan's cooperation, the Qing might not abdicate. With it, the Republic might survive. Sun faced a choice that would define his reputation: insist on revolutionary purity and risk civil war, or compromise with an embodiment of the old order to secure formal transition. He chose compromise, Sun agreed to step aside and allow Yuan to become president in exchange for the Qing emperor's abdication. The decision was pragmatic. It avoided immediate bloodshed. It preserved the republic, at least nominally. It also transferred real power away from the revolutionaries. Historians continue to debate this moment. Some view it as statesmanship under constraint. Others see it as a critical miscalculation, an early surrender of revolutionary momentum. What is clear is that Sun's power was never absolute. From the beginning, it was negotiated.
After stepping down, Sun did not disappear. He attempted to shape the republic through ideas rather than force. He helped reorganize revolutionary groups into the nationalist party, Kuomintang, seeking a constitutional path forward. This period reveals a central contradiction in Sun's political life. He was an ideologue, operating in a landscape dominated by militarists. He articulated principles, nationalism, popular sovereignty, people's livelihood, that aimed to give the republic moral and structural coherence. These ideas would later be formalized as the three principles of the people. Yet principles required enforcement. Sun lacked it. Yuan Shikai consolidated power. He sidelined parliament. He ruled through decree. When opposition emerged, it was suppressed. Sun protested, organized resistance, and appealed to constitutional legitimacy. These efforts failed. Power, it seemed, favored those with armies rather than arguments. By 1913, Sun was once more in exile. Yuan Shikai had outlawed the Nationalist Party. Revolutionary leaders were hunted. The republic Sun had helped birth was drifting toward authoritarianism. The pattern repeated. Aspiration followed by displacement. Yet exile did not render Sun irrelevant. It forced adaptation. He began to reconsider assumptions about gradualism, legality, and moral persuasion. If constitutional methods could be nullified by force, then force might be unavoidable. This realization marked another shift. Sun's relationship to power became more explicit. Ideals would still guide him, but instruments would matter more. Yuan Shikai's death in 1916 did not restore unity. It dissolved it. China fractured into regions controlled by warlords, each with their own armies, alliances, and interests. Central authority existed in name only. For Sun, this fragmentation was both obstacle and opportunity. The absence of a dominant regime created space for reorganization. It also meant perpetual instability. He established rival governments, first in Guangdong, attempting to claim legitimacy against northern regimes. These governments were often short-lived, underfunded, and militarily weak. Sun's power during this period was precarious. He depended on shifting alliances with regional military leaders, men whose loyalty was transactional rather than ideological. This dependence troubled him. The Republic had been meant to transcend personal rule. Instead, it was trapped within it. By the early 1920s, Sun Yat-sen had revised his understanding of how power could be achieved and maintained in China. Three conclusions emerged, gradually and imperfectly. Revolution required organization, not just inspiration. A disciplined party was necessary to unify disparate forces. Military power could not be ignored or outsourced indefinitely. These ideas drew partially from observation of foreign models, including Soviet organization and Japanese nationalism. Sun was pragmatic rather than doctrinaire. He borrowed methods without fully embracing ideologies. This pragmatism unsettled critics. It also expanded his reach. He reorganized the Nationalist Party along more centralized lines. He sought external assistance. He emphasized political training alongside military preparation. Power, he concluded, was not merely seized, it was constructed. Despite these efforts, Sun never ruled a unified China. His authority remained aspirational, contested, and partial. Yet,
his influence grew in another sense. He became a reference point. Competing factions claimed his legacy. His language framed debates about China's future. Power, for Sun, was never simply possession. It was direction. Still, the gap between vision and execution persisted. He relied on successors to realize projects he could only outline. He entrusted others with forces he could not fully command. This reliance would have consequences. Looking back at this phase, one sees a man repeatedly choosing between imperfect options: compromise with Yuan Shikai, alliances with warlords, engagement with foreign powers. Each choice preserved momentum while introducing risk. Sun's power was therefore cumulative but unstable. It advanced through accommodation rather than conquest. The question that lingers is whether this was wisdom or weakness. Did compromise enable survival until conditions matured? Or did it dilute the revolution's capacity to shape outcomes decisively? The record offers no simple answer.
By the end of this part of his life, Sun Yat-sen stood as a paradoxical figure, the acknowledged architect of a republic he did not control, the ideological leader of a movement still struggling to assert dominance. He had touched power, held titles, shaped discourse, yet China remained divided, unstable, unresolved. What followed would test whether the structures he built could endure beyond him, and whether the methods he adopted would produce unity or merely replace one form of fragmentation with another. Power, once approached, now demanded consequences, and those consequences were still gathering. What does influence cost when it is exercised without final control? And who pays for the distance between intention and outcome? By the early 1920s, Sun Yat-sen was no longer trying to ignite revolution. That phase had passed. The empire was gone. The republic existed, at least in name. What remained was a harder task: consolidation. This is where consequences begin to accumulate, not as a single catastrophe, but as a series of compromises whose effects extended beyond their moment. Sun's ideas had entered the bloodstream of Chinese politics. The question was what they would do there. China in the post-Yuan Shikai era was not a failed state so much as an unfinished one. Authority was dispersed among warlords who controlled territory through force, loyalty, and patronage. The central government lacked enforcement capacity. Law existed unevenly. Allegiance shifted with opportunity. For Sun, this environment represented both proof and failure. It proved his diagnosis. Without structural change, China would remain weak and vulnerable. But it also exposed the limitations of his earlier strategy. The overthrow of the Qing had not produced unity. It had revealed how thin the connective tissue of the nation was. Sun's response was not withdrawal. It was re-engagement under altered assumptions. Sun returned repeatedly to southern China, establishing rival governments in Guangdong. These administrations claimed legitimacy as true heirs of the republic, standing against northern regimes dominated by warlords. In practice, they were unstable. They relied on military leaders whose loyalty was conditional. Funding was uncertain. Authority was contested internally as much as externally. Policies were announced faster than they could be implemented. Sun served variously as president, generalissimo, or political leader, depending on the configuration of alliances at the moment. Titles shifted. Power did not settle. Historians often note the irony. Sun, who had warned against personal rule, now operated in a system that revolved around personal bargaining. He was trying to build institutions in an environment that rewarded individuals. This tension shaped his decisions. Perhaps the most consequential shift in this phase was Sun's embrace of party discipline and centralized organization.
Earlier revolutionary networks had been loose and conspiratorial. Sun now believed this was inadequate. The future required a mass party with ideological coherence, hierarchy, and enforcement capacity. The Nationalist Party was reorganized along more rigid lines. Loyalty was emphasized. Dissent was contained. Political education became as important as persuasion. This transformation borrowed selectively from foreign models, particularly the Soviet system. Sun admired the Bolsheviks' ability to mobilize, train, and control political action, even if he did not share their ultimate goals. Historians suggest that Sun's openness to these methods stemmed less from ideology than from desperation. Fragmentation had persisted too long. Unity, even imposed, seemed preferable to endless division. The cost of this choice would become clearer later. One of the most debated consequences of Sun's late strategy was his decision to cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party. At the time, the Communists were small, disciplined, and aligned with Soviet support. Sun saw them not as rivals, but as allies against warlordism and imperialism. The First United Front brought communists into the nationalist framework. Cooperation was pragmatic. Ideological differences were acknowledged but postponed. This alliance expanded organizational capacity. It also planted seeds of future conflict. Sun believed unity could be managed through structure and shared purpose. Whether this belief underestimated ideological divergence remains an open question. What is clear is that Sun prioritized momentum over resolution. As Sun's vision grew more complex, his dependence on others intensified. He relied on military commanders to enforce decisions, on party organizers to implement ideology, on foreign advisors for training and resources. Among these figures was Chiang Kai-shek, a rising military leader who would later dominate the nationalist movement. At this stage, Chiang was an instrument rather than a successor, capable, ambitious, loyal in appearance. Sun's health was declining, his time horizon was shrinking. Delegation became necessity rather than strategy. This shift altered the balance between ideas and execution. The movement increasingly reflected the priorities of those who could act, not just those who could articulate. Consequences, once again, were deferred. Throughout this period, China remained subject to foreign influence. Unequal treaties persisted, economic penetration continued, national sovereignty was incomplete. Sun's nationalist rhetoric resonated widely, but implementation lagged. Resistance required coordination. Coordination required power. Internally, factions within the Nationalist Party disagreed on methods, pace, and priorities. Some favored rapid militarization. Others emphasized social reform. Trust was uneven. Sun mediated, persuaded, and postponed decisions. He believed unity could be preserved long enough for institutions to solidify. Whether this belief was realistic remains contested. By the mid-1920s, Sun Yat-sen was gravely ill. Cancer reduced his capacity for travel and negotiation. His focus narrowed. Illness compressed time. Decisions that might have been gradual became urgent. Structures that were incomplete had to function anyway. Sun continued to write, dictate, and plan. He spoke of national unification, constitutional government, and economic reform. He did not live to test whether these plans could withstand reality. Part 4 is defined less by events than by accumulation. The consequences of Sun's choices did not fully materialize during his lifetime. They unfolded through others. Centralized party discipline enabled later authoritarianism. Alliances forged for survival became sources of fracture. Ideals adjusted for pragmatism lost some of their clarity. None of these outcomes were inevitable. None were fully preventable. Sun's influence expanded as his control diminished. He shaped trajectories he would not travel himself. As his health failed, Sun was aware that the future of his movement would not be his to direct. He had built frameworks, not outcomes. The question that lingers at the edge of this phase is not whether Sun made mistakes. It is whether any alternative path existed under the conditions he faced. Could unity have been achieved without coercion? Could discipline have avoided rigidity? Could compromise have remained temporary? The record offers ambiguity rather than verdict. What remains certain is that the consequences of Sun Yat-sen's strategies did not end with him. They were only beginning to take shape. When a life ends before its project does, who inherits the meaning? And who decides what it was for? Sun Yat-sen did not die in power. He did not preside over a unified China. He did not see the institutions he designed settle into permanence. His death, in 1925, came not as a climax, but as an interruption. What followed was not silence, but appropriation. By late 1924, Sun Yat-sen's health had deteriorated sharply. Diagnosed with liver cancer, he was physically weakened, but mentally active. He traveled to Beijing for negotiations aimed at national unification, an effort that, even then, seemed improbable. The journey itself was symbolic. Beijing, once the seat of imperial authority, was now a fragmented political space, contested and unstable. Sun arrived not as a conqueror, but as a negotiator without leverage. During these months, he continued to articulate his vision. He spoke of national sovereignty, political tutelage, constitutional government. He urged unity, discipline, and patience. The tone of his final writings is restrained. There is no triumphalism. There is also no renunciation. He did not recant his strategies or apologize for compromise. Instead, he emphasized continuity, of purpose, not control. Sun Yat-sen died on March 12, 1925. The Republic did not pause. Power struggles continued, alliances shifted. The machinery he had helped assemble moved forward without him. There was no final act to clarify his intentions, no completed constitution, no unified state to anchor interpretation. This absence mattered. In death, Sun became less a political actor and more a reference point. His words were cited, his image circulated, his authority became symbolic, available to those who claimed it. Almost immediately, competing forces sought to define Sun's legacy. The Nationalist Party presented itself as the rightful heir to his vision. It emphasized nationalism, party discipline, and unification. Under Chiang Kai-shek, the party transformed into a centralized, militarized regime. The communists, too, claimed Sun. They highlighted his anti-imperialism, his concern for social justice, and his openness to mass mobilization. They framed him as a precursor rather than an opponent. Even rival warlords and intellectual factions invoked Sun selectively. This multiplicity was possible because Sun's ideas were broad and evolving. He had left principles, not blueprints. The result was a legacy that could not be monopolized. Over time, Sun Yat-sen's image stabilized, even as interpretations diverged. He was memorialized as the father of the nation in some narratives, a title that implied origin rather than completion. Fathers begin processes, they do not finish them. This framing softened contradictions. It allowed later regimes to revere Sun while departing from his methods, or even his intentions. In mainland China, Taiwan, and overseas Chinese communities, Sun's image adapted to local political needs. Portraits, statues, and anniversaries emphasized unity, sacrifice, and renewal. What receded was uncertainty. Yet uncertainty had been central to his life.
With historical distance, assessments of Sun Yat-sen often turn on strategy. Was his willingness to compromise with militarists unnecessary evil or a foundational mistake? Did party centralization prepare China for unity or legitimize authoritarianism? Did postponing democracy preserve the possibility of order or permanently subordinate it? Historians disagree because the counterfactuals are unknowable. China's conditions were extreme. Fragmentation was real. External pressure was constant. Sun did not operate in abstraction. He responded to crises as they emerged. What can be said is that his strategies shaped the terrain on which others acted. They enabled outcomes he did not live to see, some aligning with his hopes, others diverging sharply. Unlike revolutions that end with clear regimes or constitutions, Sun's revolution dissolved into process. The Qing fell. What followed was prolonged contestation rather than settlement. Sun's life sits at the beginning of that process, not its conclusion. This complicates moral judgment. Success and failure blur. Intent and effect separate. Sun is remembered not for governing well, but for redefining what governance could mean in China. He replaced dynastic legitimacy with national legitimacy. He introduced the idea that sovereignty belonged to the people, even if the mechanism remained elusive. That shift endured. Sun Yat-sen continues to matter because he occupies a rare position in Chinese history, a unifying figure without a single political outcome. He is invoked across ideological divides precisely because he did not finish his project. His incompleteness allows continued relevance. In a sense, Sun belongs less to history than to argument. Each generation reinterprets him according to its anxieties about unity, authority, reform, and sovereignty. His life provides language for debate rather than closure. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Sun Yat-sen's legacy is what it lacks. There is no moment where he rules uncontested, no period where his ideals are fully realized under his command, no final authority to settle disputes over meaning. Instead, there is a trail of attempts, revisions, and recalibrations. This absence resists simple judgment. It invites reflection. Was Sun Yat-sen a failed leader who succeeded only in overthrow? Or was he a transitional figure whose value lay precisely in opening possibilities others would complete? The record remains open. Sun Yat-sen's death closed a life, not a chapter. The forces he helped mobilize continued to collide long after he was gone. His name became a site of contest rather than consensus. In this way, his legacy mirrors his method: provisional, adaptive, unresolved. He did not leave China settled. He left it in motion. And perhaps that was always the point.